I think it was always a matter of time before we got to sort of this point. Because I think we can all very, very, very much agree that Leave, when it was, in the referendum, oversold it. They over-egged Brexit, the benefits that it would bring, the wonders, the unicorns, everything. And Brexit at that time was sold as like this completely amorphous blob that could be everything to everyone, no matter what your political stripe or being, because that was the whole point of the Leave campaign. They knew that they could never just win solely on one argument. They had to make it be everything all at once. And we saw this time and time again. Whenever a Brexiteer was cornered on a certain topic, all of a sudden Brexit became about something else entirely and completely. Not only that, of course, we have Daniel Hannan, the guy who was cast as like the brain of Brexit, the man who had been thinking about this very thing for 40 years, that he had all the answers to all this thing. And forget about the fact, we brought out Patrick Minford as our Brexit economist. Just forget about that. Focus on Daniel Hannan for a second. When he went on Sky News and someone from the Remain campaign said that a vote for Leave was leaving the single market customs union, Daniel Hannan turned around, bold as brass, and said that a vote for Leave was not that at all, that only a fool would leave the single market and customs union. And yet here we are. And many people voted thinking that that was the case. And many people voted for various different stupid reasons. Some voted just to give David Cameron a kicking because they didn't like David Cameron. They didn't even care about Brexit or the consequences of it. They just wanted to get, spit in David Cameron's face. But that's that. But we are, of course, where we are. And it was inevitable, of course, that those true blue believers of course Brexit was sooner or later gonna actually have to face reality sooner or later, that Brexit was not going to be the balm that solved all their problems, that was going to be the ultimate solution to everything. Meanwhile, of course, you now have these Brexiteers who believed all these promises, and of course those promises have never come true, they've never come to pass, and eventually they'll be left with two options. Either A, they will have to admit that they were lied to and that actually Brexit wasn't all it was cracked up to be, or they'll go the Nigel Farage route and start saying, oh, Brexit was just not done properly. And we've got this very interesting one to go over today. We have a guy who goes to one of the most Brexit backing areas. And what do we see? Resentment building. Why? Because of Brexit, because they were promised all these Brexit benefits and they're nowhere to be seen. So, before we get into this, please do remember to click on the like, share, and subscribe button. And down below, of course, there are links to my Patreon page, the one-off donation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can buy me coffee, the YouTube thank you button, and of course, as always, there's the Pony Club down below as well. So let's crack on then into this. So, when Keir Starmer was asked last week whether he thought Britons had finally moved on from the issue of Brexit, he answered with a definitive yes. Unfortunately, that is not the case when you look at the polls. And of course, it is not difficult to see why the Prime Minister would, of course, hope to settle the question. A week before that, he hopes now to reset the UK's relationship with the EU, clearing the way now for an easier market access to a marketplace that could help increase economic growth that he so now badly needs. But at a very difficult kind of marketplace, in the one almost now stridently Brexit-backing parts of the country, the answer was not so clear-cut. Gazing up from his display of scented products at his family stall on the high street in Gray's Thurrock, Nigel Guest briefly pondered, saying, "It feels like we never left the EU, to be honest," replied Guest, 56, a lifelong native of Essex constituency, who, along with now the overwhelming 72% of local voters, helped the UK leave the EU back in 2016. Only 3 other districts backed Brexit to the very same extent. He continued, saying that I just feel like it was a missed opportunity. Yes, people were sometimes fed bullshit, but if we were asked what we wanted to come out, and people around here literally voted in their droves for it, we've never really seen the investment we were promised. And who promised that investment? Well, first of all, the Brexiteers just saying, oh, don't worry, all that money that we, quote, no longer send the EU, we can spend here. Not true, of course, time and time again. The whole NHS promise. Ultimately, of course, he's probably referring to the Boris Johnson promise of levelling up. Don't worry, guys, we'll level you up. Now we're outside of the EU, but of course, that never happened either. But back to this. His partner, Sarah, of course, went even further, accusing now successive governments of a betrayal. Money that she believed had been saved on exiting the EU should now have been channeled into improving it and other public services, she said. That was never going to happen. That money was just not there. There was no money saved by leaving the EU. Such sentiments are, of course, not hard to find behind the bustle now of the Friday market. Nestled in the back on the bank of the Thames, a short drive just earlier than train ride from Tisbury Docks, part of the Thames Freeport. In a period before the EU referendum, Thurrock recorded now the lowest levels of life satisfaction anywhere in the UK, but hostility towards immigration now was what was trapped into by the BNP and then later UKIP. With very similar messaging, Reform UK is now eyeing its electoral prospects here, where it came second in last year's general election. But the postponement now of local elections could also now have added Thurrock Council, declared effectively bankrupt back in 2022, to the list of those it won on May the 1st. And oh boy, that would have been fun to see Reform taking over a bankrupt council. Because this is something else that I've got to mention. All these Reform councils, they're going, oh yeah, we're going to lower your council tax. All these councils that they've took over already in financial difficulty, and now they're going, oh yeah, we're going to lower your council tax. How are they going to pay for all those services, those adult social care, those child services, fill all those potholes? Some of these councils are headed to some very bad problems, but there's more on that later, maybe. Yet, of course, economic green shoots have emerged. Not at least, of course, in Tilbury, where plans now were submitted last week to try and expand the thriving port by as much as 40 hectares. Thurrock is, of course, very much like any red wall seat. It just happened to be in the south rather than the north, said Jackie Dale Price, who is now the local Conservative MP from 2010 until last year, when Jen Craft won the seat for Labour, which it held now for the most of the period after the Second World War. It is very close to London, but Brexit was, of course, an opportunity for those who felt that politics was leaving them behind to voice their dissatisfaction. People have now moved on from the vote in many ways, but the one thing that really cut through during the referendum campaign was the immigration debate and has now got worse. What was promised hasn't materialized because immigration has continued to remain high. Well, Brexit only made it get worse, as we've seen very recently in a lot of those polls. So those shifts, of course, in demographics are vividly illustrated now by the changing face of the high street, where a diverse range of new restaurants, food stores, and other retailers have arrived over the past decade, to which I would say, who cares? Surely that would give more variety to your high streets, right? Anyway, those, of course, newcomers do include Hassam Naeem, who was optimistic about the town's future since establishing Sabine, a supermarket selling hair and body products to Afro-Caribbean customers and others. He said there's a good community here, and we have been promised that regeneration of the town is coming, he said. And for the question of potential tensions over immigration, he had praised now for the government's plans to, of course, tighten policy. At a West African restaurant, next door, sorry, there was, of course, a candid if cheerful, reflection from Father Paschal Uskip, who, of course, fetched lunch now with a fellow Catholic priest, Chacho Ocano, saying it shouldn't be overstated, but sometimes you see the divides that might have been even with our community. So there are certain masses that might have been either more white or the crowds or others where you've got more mainly West African or a more migrant community. As for Brexit, he said, his experience now of working elsewhere in Essex, saying, I think, speaking personally, that some people might have been hit by the realities, whether it was about travel, certain conveniences, or whatever else, and feel now that they are still waiting to see the benefits. While they wait, however, house prices and rents in the area have now been rising, with levels far beyond the reach for local people, a point emphasised by Neil Woodbridge. This social enterprise employs over 200 staff now supporting local disabled people, saying, I didn't pick up, of course, on the huge amount of regret from my staff who voted for Brexit. As with elsewhere, it was an up yours to the government, and I think they would do it again, which is the big problem. You cannot just go, well, I don't really care what the question is or what the consequences might be. I just want to say a big up yours to the government. There were a lot of people who voted in 2016 who that was their sentiment. To get to spit in the face of David Cameron. And they didn't really care about the consequences. They didn't care about the question. They didn't care about that, which is still very worrying to this point. So he continues saying Keir Starmer, of course, might be right to the extent that Brexit is now in the past for them, but the reality is that they are struggling. They are calling it now the Thurrock struggle, and where people go, yeah, whatever, because they've always felt let down by the government. There are now such great opportunities, whether it's by the port's expansion locally or in the direction of the economy going, hopefully, it is hopefully going. But people need to be brought along. Otherwise, it's just storing up big problems. So there you go. People not so much Brexit regret, but feeling let down in many ways by the promises of Brexit. And I would say to them, it's not Labour you should be pointing the finger at. It's people like Nigel Farage. It's people in UKIP, people who are the Brexiteers, people who are part of the Leave campaign. They were the ones that promised you all this stuff. They're the people who you should be angry at. And I don't know if or when, honestly, that will ever happen. But I feel it has to happen at some point. I really do feel it has to happen at some point, sooner or later. But we'll see. So, as always, let me know what you think down below. And of course, as always, we'll see you all next time.